wanted to learn, like, what is this idea of a comet year? Like, is this something that has occurred to people in the past, or this was, a colloquialism that used to exist? And it turns out there's this rich and fascinating and strange history of people sort of projecting meaning onto specifically the appearance of a comet. And it turns out that comets had happened to appear and to coincide with really sort of cataclysmic historical events going back thousands of years. And people would say, "Oh, it's because of the comet. The comet is sort of showing its wrath on us." And it was so surprising and a little bit disorienting to recognize that. And now again, here we are in sort of a global crisis, and there's a comet in the sky. Like, what are the odds of this? And as I dug a little deeper and read more to try and understand how to make sense of this for myself, I came to realize that what was actually happening here is that we have this humans, I think, have this latent tendency to want to use a story, um, not necessarily always to explain things with fidelity and truthfulness, but perhaps just to give ourselves a sense of control over events that seem chaotic or confusing.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Clayton Dalton. Clayton is a writer who covers the strange and fascinating corners of science and health, with a focus on the therapeutic potential of illicit drugs, the intersection between climate change and human health, and the interdependency of the world around and within us. He has a medical degree from Columbia University and is a Harvard-trained emergency physician. His recent story in Nautilus was The Comet Year: What the COVID-19 Pandemic Portends. Clayton, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Brian. Good to be here.
All right, to start off, could you summarize your intellectual and academic background a bit and tell us how you got started writing about science?
Sure. My college education was primarily American history, not by design, just by interest. I didn't figure out till I was a junior in college that I was most of the way to a history degree just by dint of taking what sounded good to me. And I was like, okay, I guess that's my degree. But it's basically an education in reading and writing and thinking, which has proven very valuable to me. I didn't realize I was interested in medicine or even science at all until after I graduated from college. There was a little bit of discovery to figure out what I wanted to do. Um, and ended up falling in love with medicine and science, and going to medical school in New York City, and then did my residency training in emergency medicine in Boston, which has been fascinating and rich and interesting and strange. Clinical medicine is a really interesting lens into the world because it blends. It's not pure science. It's not pure academic research. It ties all of these things together and folds them in with people and humans and our weaknesses, and our failings, um, and all of the various currents of sort of social determinants of health, economic determinants of health, genetic determinants of health, all of it, everything that goes into this big pot. That is my day job when I go to work in the hospital. So it's extremely interesting. And I started writing about science and medicine when I was in residency in Boston. There was still this part of me that sort of missed what I was doing when I would go to my history courses in college, and that ended up being a really enjoyable and fruitful way for me to engage with what I found interesting in the world that was different from clinical medicine and my work in the hospital. So I'm really fortunate to have these two different jobs that are similar, but come at the world from a slightly different angle, using different tools, with different aims. So I'm thrilled to be able to do both.
Yeah, that's great. So once again, your new story in Nautilus is The Comet Year, which will be the cover story for our upcoming print magazine, issue 49. Could you give us a brief summary of your story for our viewers who haven't read it yet?
Yes, um, if I can. It's an interesting and I think somewhat unexpected take on what just happened. Like what like we're sort of through the acute phase of this crisis that we all just went through together. And in terms of trying to make sense of what happened, there's so many different perspectives that we can take. There's so many things that happened, so many things that could have gone better, so many surprising developments. And this is one way to look back and try and make sense of some of what happened, um, in a way to learn something about ourselves and our tendencies, especially in moments of fear and uncertainty and crisis, that I think are still going to be relevant in the future. And the kernel, the seed for the story, um, occurred back in 2020 in the first pandemic summer. And as some of the readers may remember, there was a brilliant and incredible comet that appeared in the sky in the late spring and early summer of 2020. It was the first time that a comet had been visible to the naked eye in a long time. And I was at that moment, I was with my then wife in a mountain shack in Colorado. We had taken a little bit of time away from the hospital before we went back to Boston, and we were in the Elk Mountains in central Colorado, and the night sky is just tremendous. And there was a comet, and it was one of the strangest things that I've ever seen. I mean, there's just weird looking, beautiful, and kind of haunting. And and so my wife and I were talking about it, and she at the time was revisiting one of her favorite books, which is Middlemarch by George Eliot. And there was this incredible line that she happened to come across as she was sort of paging through this old book of hers, revisiting. And a character mentioned this idea of a comet year. Things will grow and ripen as if it were a comet year. Um, Things will come to a cometary heat. And I was like, what? Like the serendipity was jarring and surprising. And so I wanted to learn, like, what is this idea of a comet year? Like, is this something that has occurred to people in the past, or this was, a colloquialism that used to exist? And it turns out there's this rich and fascinating and strange history of people sort of projecting meaning onto specifically the appearance of a comet. And it turns out that comets had happened to appear and to coincide with really sort of cataclysmic historical events, going back thousands of years. And people would say, "Oh, it's because of the comet. The comet is sort of sowing its wrath on us." And it was so surprising, and a little bit disorienting to recognize that. And now again, here we are in sort of a global crisis, and there's a comet in the sky. Like, what are the odds of this? And as I dug a little deeper and read more to try and understand how to make sense of this for myself, I came to realize that what was actually happening here is that we have this humans, I think, have this latent tendency to want to use a story, um, not necessarily always to explain things with fidelity and truthfulness, but perhaps just to give ourselves a sense of control over events that seem chaotic or confusing or disorienting. And that's what was happening in these years past, when people say, "Oh, it's a comet year," right? The comet that appeared in the sky foretold Napoleon's defeat in Russia in 1811 that Tolstoy wrote about. And this is just this human tendency to tell a story, to take control of events that seem chaotic. And that struck me as deeply relevant in the pandemic, because we had this bizarre proliferation of crazy stories that people were latching onto, gravitating towards, to provide some sense of explanation or understanding of what was happening. And they tended to be rather conspiratorial. These ideas that COVID was a bioweapon, the vaccines contained nanobots that were going to alter your DNA, and lockdowns were a part of, a government conspiracy to control the population. Really strange stories. And I think many of us were like, what is happening? Like, what is happening that so many people seem to be latching on to stories that seem certifiably wild? And it was the same tendency that led people to ascribe significance or blame to a comet when something calamitous happened in years past. It's the same thing. And that seemed really relevant to try and understand where things kind of went off track in the pandemic, why there was so much susceptibility to these crazy stories that led people to make decisions that compromised our ability to keep ourselves safe, to limit the virus's spread, to bring the pandemic to a close perhaps sooner. I think it prolonged things, it made them worse. And and this is a latency in our own minds and the way that we engage with the world, the way that we project meaning onto the world, that isn't going to go away, right? This is, I think, hardwired into our brains and our minds and has been there, ever since the emergence of language, I suspect. And no doubt we will face future calamities. Climate change, chief among them, will bring many calamities. I think that will be a great challenge that will require concerted effort, right? That will require that we share a mutual story about what's happening, how to confront the challenge. And I think that this latent tendency in our minds to tell a story, any story, in a time of crisis, is going to make that harder, just as it made it harder to meet the challenge of COVID collectively. So I think it's, as much as we all want to kind of close the book on this chapter on COVID, I think that there are many lessons to be learned from it, but this, I think, is a big one, and it's going to matter in the next crisis that we face.
Did you have a sense when you saw the comet and your wife made that comment about the comet year? Did you have a sense that you wanted to write about it then, after kind of digging in more into the research and history of this phenomenon?
Definitely, because it was just such a strange coincidence that I was able to realize pretty quickly had this really rich and interesting historical background. And as someone who first came to reading and writing and thinking critically through the sort of lens of history, this was especially interesting to me. So I definitely had a sense that there was something here that I think could make a very interesting story.
What were some of your first thoughts on how to go about writing it and starting the piece?
I started by really just reading, searching, trying to find anything that I could, to help me understand the historical significance of comets. Right? Where did this idea of a comet year come from? And that took me pretty far and wide. Some academic papers, some textbooks, other sources. It was a pretty broad sort of research effort to collect all of this background, and it was really interesting and quite an enjoyable process because the history is so strange and rich and unexpected, and unexpectedly relevant to us today. So this is the sort of thing that I loved about history, and a lot of my other writing will have a pretty heavy historical bent. I think that's just an approach that I tend to take and enjoy taking. And I also, for me, history is interesting and useful primarily because it usually offers some context, for whatever it is that we're dealing with today, right? Be it writing about something in medicine, right? There's historical precedent and context for why things are the way they are today. And I think it helps us understand the world around us if we can understand what are the antecedents and where did we come from and why did things develop in this way? Could they have been different?
What area of history has been your primary focus?
When I was a college student, it was American history, mostly early 20th century, but some 19th century as well. Spent a lot of time in courses centered around the Second World War. That was very interesting to me because I feel like that period of time is the sort of two world wars, and especially the Second World War and then the immediate post-war era. It sort of explains America's position in the world today. I think 1945 was the birth of the sort of global order as we have known it since then. And that was certainly no guarantee. There were many things that happened in the course of those world events that led to things turning out the way that they did. And there were many moments in which things could have been completely different. And then I would say in most of my writing as a journalist and a writer, Um, more of the sort of aspect of history that informs my writing more tends to be more the history of medicine, history of science, how we got to where we are today in terms of medicine and the tools that we have to offer and how we approach things is itself an incredibly fascinating story, full of bizarre twists and turns and missteps that I find deeply interesting and also helpful, I think, in providing again context for whatever it is I might be writing about.
You have this line in the story about how Americans have never been immune to conspiratorial ideas throughout our history.
Yeah, that quote was drawn from a fascinating paper that was published by an historian named Richard Hofstadter in 1964, if I remember correctly. And he was making that point back in the 1960s, um, chiefly because Joseph McCarthy was had just kind of come out of his ascendancy, and so that was the sort of conspiratorial, paranoid style of political thought that was familiar to most people at that time. And much like today, we see how much conspiratorial rhetoric, paranoid thinking has come to dominate much of our politics now. Hofstadter was trying to make sense of that back in the early 1960s on the heels of McCarthy. And so he looked back further, again, for context, right? And he says, even though this, most people may not realize, they may look at McCarthy and say, where did this come from? He goes back through the record and will remind his readers that, this has always been part of our culture, our politics, maybe in more subtle ways, maybe less dominant. And I think what I took from that is again kind of going back to what we were speaking about just a few minutes ago, that this tendency is latent in our psychology. This tendency to want to tell a story, to provide a sense of meaning, provide a sense of coherence, provide a sense of certainty, to sort of soothe, because feeling uncertain about things is a really uncomfortable feeling. And I think that we are just predisposed at baseline to shy away from feeling uncertain about things. And so this storytelling ability that we can narrativize the world. And there is a tendency to do so with less fidelity to accuracy and truth and objectivity, and more so to just create a story that gives us a sense of control, that we know what's going on. We have a sense of who the good actors are and the bad actors are, to soothe that sense of uncertainty. And that's been happening in our country, no doubt elsewhere, for a long time. One thing that the piece touches on is that what concerns me is that the way that we've built our digital technologies, social media, and other aspects of the internet are turning up the intensity. They are exploiting this latent human psychological tendency to favor a story that soothes the sense of uncertainty over one that is dedicated to exploring nuance and uncertainty. I think the way we've set up our digital technologies, it promotes that. It rewards it. It it sort of selects for it, and so more people see it, and it has this feed forward sort of feedback loop quality to it. I think that may get even worse as we see new technologies based on artificial intelligence entering the picture. We'll see, but I am a little worried that as we move into facing the myriad other crises that we will inevitably face collectively, globally, our own technologies are going to make it ever more difficult for us to tell a coherent, collective, mutually agreed upon story about what's happening and what we need to do about it.
You write about how a member of your extended family, a tenured professor at a major university, began promoting conspiracy theories on a family email thread. How did you handle that, given the direct experience you've had treating COVID patients?
this was one of the stranger experiences that we had during the pandemic. It brought things home in a way that was really surprising and unnerving. Up until that point, there was some there was some abstractness, there was some remoteness in terms of seeing what was happening with conspiratorial thinking with regard to the pandemic. Um, and then when this started happening, this is someone who is a brilliant person, highly credentialed, um, PhD from Ivy League institutions, tenured professor at a major research university. I mean, this is someone who has a lot of prestige um, behind his name, and started promoting conspiracy theories on this family thread, and not only on the family email thread, but also he made appearances on television news. He actually testified in front of some state legislatures, and so he was promoting these ideas that had the imprimatur of his prestige and his pedigree. Um, but the ideas were crazy. He would say things like, "COVID is not dangerous. It's the old line that it's just like the flu." He said that it's just a marker for people who are being killed by their chronic diseases like diabetes, which is absurd if you have any sort of clinical medical training. And I tried to engage with him. Yes, you said, how do we deal with this? I actually had a few phone calls. We had a few Zooms. I was interested in really trying to engage with him and say, like, I'm I am on the front line. I see COVID every day at work. I touch it. It comes home on me, right? The virus has probably been in my body. I see what it does. And it was just impenetrable. Nothing that I could say would give him any sort of pause. Um, there was no open mindedness to saying, huh, okay, this is what you're seeing. How do I reconcile that with what I had been thinking about? It was actually, I mean, it was in a way fascinating to observe, because this is how conspiratorial thinking operates, right? Nothing can puncture that enclosed cognitive space when you are adherent to a conspiracy theory. Any challenge, any new piece of information can be distorted, folded in a way that is still consistent with the conspiracy theory. And so he had a response for everything that I would say, even though it didn't make any sense if you had medical training or experience, which he did not. But he was
Mm.
so confident, so self-assured. It was, I mean, I could, it was almost as if I could see in real time the sort of safety and insulation that a story, any story, can provide in a chaotic and uncertain time. Like, he had this sense that he knew, he had this inside knowledge. He knew what was really happening. It gave him a sense of security and stability, which I think is the appeal of this sort of narrative tendency that we have latent in ourselves. Whereas from my perspective, I, I I like to think that I try and be accurate in terms of how I'm describing reality, how I'm thinking about it, how I represent it. And there's always uncertainty. There's always nuance. We get things wrong. We learn. We develop our understanding. It's complicated. This is true of I think any serious engagement with the world, right? It's we refine our understanding. It's iterative. It's difficult. It's complicated. It requires some interpretation. And so I was offering a perspective that was all of those things. I was like, well, here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I think. But we're learning things. Our understanding is changing, and it's not this like very powerful, reassuring, strong, coherent, simple, certain narrative, because the world is almost never those things. And so that seeing that contrast between his perspective and then the one that I was trying to offer was very striking, very striking.
Mm.
And this is someone who you think would have some intellectual immunity to falling prey to this sort of narrative, because he has a terminal degree, he has a PhD, right? So you would think that someone who has advanced academic training is well versed in how difficult it is to know things and how knowledge is always provisional. It evolves. It's nuanced, right? He has formal training in these things. And so it was all the more striking that despite that, he was still susceptible to the seductiveness of an oversimplified conspiratorial narrative. It was fascinating, but also incredibly disturbing.
Right. Yeah, you talk about some of the factors that make people more prone to believing in conspiratorial ideas. And I mean, some of these include, feeling lonely and lack of social connections, or, feeling more uncertain than you otherwise might be from, economic insecurity. But I presume this person did not, those factors were not relevant in his case, which just seems especially striking. Like it has a lot of kind of things in his life that must have been a buffer against sort of falling into these ideas, which it just seems, yeah, like you said, kind of even more surprising.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. And I think that the way that I interpret that is this was a demonstration of how powerful and seductive this mode of thought can be. Because here's someone who you would think would have a lot of insulation and protection against falling prey to this sort of cognitive trap, and he did anyways. And so I think that speaks to the power of it.
Yeah. How has the internet affected this human tendency to cope with crises and uncertainty?
Great question. I think, and I'm by no means an expert here, but my sense, my own understanding of how this has occurred is that most of the way that we have designed social media primarily is in a way that prioritizes engagement. So you want people to spend more time looking. You want people to spend more time engaged with your platform. And it's not necessarily a commitment to things that are socially beneficial or good. So it's not necessarily a commitment to advancing a better understanding of the scientific process for the public, right? It's not necessarily oriented towards improving or being careful around other elements of sort of social culture at large. It's really, they're built to prioritize engagement. They want you to stay looking at your screen, looking at your phone. And at risk of oversimplifying things, my understanding of how that's done is these platforms are designed to recognize in a way content that is a little bit more extreme, a little bit more enticing, that we have a harder time looking away from. There was a quote in the piece from Tristan Harris, who is a co-founder of an institution called the Center for Humane Technology, and I think is one of the smartest and most eloquent people who are thinking and speaking about how do we be more careful with the technology that we've created, and what are some of the downsides or dark sides of it. And he offers an analogy which I think is very helpful and illuminating. He says, when you're driving down the highway, if there's a car crash on the side of the road, you're going to look at it, right? You just can't help it. There's something that's happened, something calamitous or catastrophic. You can't not look. And the same is true of content online that is like this. Things that are more extreme, that are a little shocking, will hold our attention better than things that are less so. And then the platforms will select for that sort of content and boost it and recommend it to more people, because that is what will hold people's attention longer. And so these conspiracy theories, for example, that were very prominent during the worst periods of the pandemic, are basically the informational equivalent of a car crash, right? The idea that the government is actually taking advantage of this crisis to institute, this was a phrase that was used very commonly, and I think appears at least once in the piece, medical martial law. This is a very popular conspiracy theory, especially early on when we had more lockdowns. There was this idea that the government was using this opportunity to implement martial law to control us, and that this was primarily a democratic plot. And this was a very widely shared, viewed, and held perspective as far as I can tell. And that is the informational equivalent of a car crash, right? That's a very extreme, jarring, potentially frightening, in a perverse way, kind of an exciting idea. And it's hard to look away from that. That is an idea that if it is served up to you in your social media feed, will definitely hold your attention more effectively than someone who's going into the nuance of mRNA vaccine development, right? Which is complicated and technical and hard to understand, even for me. And I have a medical degree. Like that's just jargon for most people, but a very seductive, exciting, sort of dark idea, like this idea of medical martial law, that you're going to click on that and you're going to share it. And the platforms have, either by design or just by consequence of the way that they were designed, recognize that and amplify it. That is an emergent property of the way we have designed our social media platforms. And that, I think, had a lot to do with just how prominent these sort of crazy ideas became during the pandemic. I think that's part of why many political figures start. I mean, it's crazy to me that we have people in the United States Senate, or who were president, who were using those offices to promote conspiracy theories. Like, straight up, that's crazy. But I think part of it is that they saw, primarily through what was happening with social media, they saw the power of those ideas to elicit engagement and to draw attention. It's like the social media algorithms taught them that the informational equivalent of a car crash is a very powerful thing that tickles human psychology in a particular way that is really powerful. And I think they learned that, and they have deployed it in, I would say, a pretty unscrupulous manner. But nevertheless, they have used it to accumulate power. I mean, we see people have used these techniques to win office, and then use that office to continue promoting these sorts of ideas. It's really quite disturbing and alarming.
Yeah, and it's a way to exploit particularly kind of American psyche with being vigilant about tyranny, because we're taught about how the patriotic founding of our country was resistance against tyranny. So whenever there's any signs of that, it's kind of, it activates people's, maybe the nobler virtues to, want to
Absolutely.
find out about it and resist it.
Absolutely. I think that is a really insightful point. It goes back to the importance of history for context, right? I think that what we're talking about, I think, is probably latent in human psychology everywhere. But cultures vary around the world. And I think you're right. I think that the culture that we have in the United States, based on our unique historical context, I think might make people even a bit more susceptible to this sort of rhetoric, because we are, in a way, primed, as you say, to be wary of tyranny. Um, not a bad thing, but perhaps also a weakness that we've now seen exploited.
Hmm. What was it like treating patients during the first pandemic winter?
Hard. It was hard. We for the first pandemic winter, I left my job in Boston. So I was there. I was in Boston for the first wave in spring of 2020, and that was terrible in its own right. I mean, just critically ill people just flooding the emergency department left and right, um, intubating people just one after another. Many of whom I'm sure never woke up again. Um, and then in the late fall, I took a job in a small hospital in western New Mexico. And in one of the hardest hit counties in the United States. And we didn't have the resources or the capacity to treat everyone who came to us. And so we had to do a lot of transfers. And I would have a critically ill hypoxic COVID patient. So somebody whose lungs are just being ravaged by the virus. They have critically low oxygen levels. They need an ICU, maybe a ventilator. And we would call 40 to 60 hospitals from Texas to Southern California to Nevada to the Dakotas, just trying to find a bed for these people. And it was awful. And many of them would, I'm sure, we would send them, we would fly them to Nevada, for instance. And many of those people, I think, would probably die there just because of how sick some of these patients were. And it's horrible for the families too, right? They have their loved ones who are critically ill or dying or dead, hundreds of miles away, no way to get to them, no way to easily recover their body. It was awful. And I think in the crux of that most difficult period, every now and again we would have someone who would come in who would have fallen prey to some of the conspiratorial ideas about the virus or the vaccine. And it was really difficult to engage with those patients after everything that we had seen and done. And I would have some patients who had fallen prey to these ideas. They didn't think the virus was real. They didn't think it was bad. They thought the vaccines were killing people, and so they didn't get the shots. And then after they caught it, I had a number of patients like this. Once they realized how sick they were and in how much danger they truly were, now having finally caught the virus and having become quite sick, they would come to me. And there was this horrible, you could tell there was this horrible feeling that they'd gotten it wrong. And now they saw the horrible reality of the virus, and it was too late. And maybe some of those people came through, maybe some of them died, maybe some of them have irreparable permanent lung injury. But there was a moment that I saw in people's faces a number of times where they realized that what they had been served by the algorithms on social media had been a lie. And once they finally came face to face with the virus, they were like, oh, this is actually really bad. It was terrible to see.
Yeah, that's awful experience. What are you working on now? Any other pieces in the works?
Yeah, I'm working on a piece right now, supported by a grant from the Berkeley Center for Psychedelics. They have a journalism grant to support projects focused on psychedelics, which is very generous. And the piece is trying to understand what is happening in the brain that explains what we're seeing with psychedelics and their efficacy for mental health problems. I think by now a lot of people are aware, probably especially Nautilus readers, are aware that over the past 10 years we've seen a sort of explosion of research on psychedelic compounds, specifically in use for treatment of mental health problems. And there have been some incredibly promising results. And how they work in the brain and why they seem to help people with depression or substance use disorders or things like that is a really interesting question. So I'm working on a piece right now, pretty early stages, trying to explore that and understand the fact that, like, what are they doing in the brain? What does it tell us about the nature of the brain, the nature of mental illness, the nature of healing from mental illness, even the nature of consciousness? So that's a big project, but it's been very interesting so far and really fun.
That's really cool. All right,
Yeah.
Clayton, to close out, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online? Do you have a website where they could check out your work, or any social media channels they can follow? I know how you feel about social media, but perhaps
I was just
you
gonna
use
say,
it.
you can probably tell that I'm not a big social media user. I think technically I do have a Facebook profile, but I almost never use it. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on Instagram. I do have a website. It's claytondalton.com. That does have all of my previously published work. And that's also a good way to contact me. So if anyone has questions, thoughts, comments on on anything that I've done before, there's a way to contact me on the website, and I would love to hear from people.
All right, excellent. Clayton, it's been great. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat.
It's my pleasure, Brian. Thanks for having me.